And we're live. So this is episode 4 of the Fairgo Basic Income Discussion Group. In the first one, we had a UBI proposal, which was the Abigail Boyd from the Greens and the New South Wales Greens and the what was it called again, Josh? Do you remember what it was called? The
well-being.
That's right, Stephen.
Yeah.
Thank you. The well-being payment, which was a proposal that we looked at. Then we had a discussion group in a more without a special guest the month after that, where we looked at Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. Then we had a proposal again last month, which was the guaranteed livable income, which was a proposal by a sort of group of advocates. We had 3 of the authors of that on. This month we're doing another discussion one, another sort of theoretical one. So it's most similar to the David Graeber Bullshit Jobs one we did. Looking at bullshit jobs and how a basic income might free us of those. But today we're talking about the economic impact of a basic income overall. How do you pay for it? What effect does it have on the economy? What effect does it have on wages? What effect does it have on inflation? And Stephen actually asked in Facebook a very good question: what impact does it have on house prices? So these are all great questions. Now, rather than doing the casual icebreaker that we normally do, this time I was going to start with Michael and giving us a 5-minute presentation on what's been up with the Australian Reserve Bank recently, because that's important sort of context for what we're talking about. But Michael we can't seem to get Michael's audio going. I'm going to ask to unmute. He can hear us. I can see from his lips that he can hear us. I'm clicking ask to unmute, and he should get a prompt to unmute. This is the last. Hello, he's unmuted, but I still can't hear him. And that's okay. We'll have to see if we can come back to Michael later in the show. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to show a couple of graphs to start the conversation off. So I'm going to, you'll all permit me to do a little bit of screen sharing. And that will be this Google Doc right here. Now, what I've got here are 2 graphs. One is from the CSIRO, and it shows climate change predictions and actual results of changes in the climate. The black line is actual recorded temperature. The gray thick line behind it is their predicted range of temperature and how temperature would move with global warming. Hey, Josh, yeah?
Any chance we could get a link to this in the chat so we can browse it?
I'll link to the document. Yeah, sure. I'll do that right now. All right, hold on a sec. We'll go to the chat and send that through to you guys. Let's just stop screen share just for a second to send this in the chat. All right, and screen share's back on. So what this is a projection and then an actual recording of the data on climate change, right? This is running a simulation, and these are the results that they get. And then here we have the Reserve Bank trying to predict wages. And you have what the black line is the actual line, right? And then these this is what actually happened. These are their eternally optimistic predictions that wages are about to bounce back, taking us to the middle of last year when this graph's a few years old, but we've had a rough few years as well since then. So the reason I'm showing this is because a lot of people would say that sort of we shouldn't even be having this conversation, that economics is the realm of the experts, and that the way me having an opinion on government spending is like someone having some amateur climatologist having an opinion on climate change, right? And so why we want people, personally, I want people to listen to the experts when it comes to climate change. why don't I think the same thing about economics? And there are a lot of reasons, about, I think there's more values, a lot more value many more value judgments in economics than in climate science that, could be debatable and personal. But also they just don't have anywhere near the same predictive capacity. And so I want to talk about why I think mainstream economics is wrong. And basically what I'm going to end up summing up is saying that they misunderstand not just money in general, but especially government spending and banks. And because of that, they underestimate how much spending the government is capable of without negative effects. And so before we get stuck into that, I thought we'll go around the room and just see if anybody else has wants to give some opening thoughts about what, about this question of spending and the government spending, basic income, and the macroeconomic effects. So if anyone would like to have a comment on that, please put your hand up now.
I'll just say all we hear is big numbers. That's all I'm hearing. Like when you read the paper or read some commentary, you just get the big, 6.3 billion here, 23 billion there, and like that's it. Like 650 million for mental health. It's kind of all those big numbers. So yeah, it's the tyranny of big numbers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the question is, what do we think those numbers mean, right? Because, and what are those numbers a percentage of, right? And they're often compared to the existing budget. So that's the equivalent to, another, they might say it's 1.5, it's another 50% on top of the existing federal budget or something like that. Might be how it's presented if it's given any context. But I mean, what I don't want to do here is argue with headlines. You know what I mean? Right? Like I want us to try and get a bit deeper and just understand it ourselves and know what we really think, rather than sort of prepare for the battle of with what the press is going to throw around. Just so I mean, well, let me move on to the next graph. I've got a lot of graphs for today. This is okay. So I invited an economist who I know is quite opposed to the point of view that I'm presenting to come on today, and he said he wasn't going to come because he's just not interested in these monetary theories, which is mostly MMT is the famous one, modern monetary theory. But the part that I'm most disappointed about is because I wanted to show him this graph and ask for his response, right? So here is the graph. It's this one here. This is from the whitehouse.gov, this data. And what it shows us is the budget surplus or deficit as a percentage of GDP. That's the red line. When it's down like this, it's a deficit. When it's above, it's a surplus. And the bottom is billions of US GDP in US GDP, right? And what we see is that basically since records were started in the 1930s, the US government has been in deficit almost all the time, right? Yet the economy continues to grow. So what is the point of this is that do we think that the US has been overall wrong this whole time, that the whole basic fiscal stance that it's had since the 1930s has been wrong? So let's imagine that this line had been up here as a surplus, right? What do we imagine the US would look like? Is that the problem, that they've been running these deficits? And if they were running it up here, they'd all be living in Jetson's flying car world. That's one possible position you could take, right? That if they were running surpluses the whole time, that would mean that the economy was functioning better and more efficiently and more lean and be more lean, and that would have led to a better outcome. I take the opposite position. I think if they'd run more deficits, they'd be in a better position.
They don't seem to care too much about deficits in the US, though, don't they? Like they're not. There's not as big a focus.
Not as much
Australia.
as
Well,
I
if the
think.
Democrats are in power.
Okay.
Okay, Michael, we do have audio. Fantastic.
Hey.
So you were saying that when the Democrats are in power, we'll hear a lot about deficits because the Republicans will bring it up. Yeah. Which is because the Republicans use deficits as an excuse to not give things to poor people.
Yeah.
Right, as a reason to keep the poor and not have a proper safety net or anything like that. They use deficit as an excuse. I also think it's the fact that they both sort of teams kind of know that it's impossible to always run balanced budgets or run surpluses. So they just know it's always a way to attack the other side, even if no one. But again, there's this idea of what that I've probably mentioned in one of the chats before. I feel like I have. Zizek calls it a virtual belief. It's a belief that everybody acts like they believe, but no one actually believes it. So everyone acts like they believe that Stalin is the greatest or whatever, even though everyone's pretending to each other, and there's nobody left who's sort of innocent of the deceit, right? And I feel like that's kind of what happens with deficits and public discourse, right? So this is
Could I jump in there?
Please, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent that's true, but there is a fear, in fact, on both sides, and possibly rightly, that if you just say, and this is Philip Lowe's position, who's head of the Reserve Bank, that if you just feed the government whatever money they say they want, the right will drop taxes and do whatever projects it likes. The left will boost welfare and do whatever it likes. And in effect, there is no control. And so that's one of the reasons why, and I can step in here and talk about now the Reserve Bank, which is what you asked me to do, or you can keep going. I'm happy.
We'll come back around to the Reserve Bank because I've sort of launched into this little bit of it now.
Okay. Yep.
But this is this is where I do want to come back around to that. But this idea, okay, that if the central bank gives money to the government to spend, which is what we're going to get to, but we'll get there in a couple of steps, because first I want to talk about what everybody else thinks, right? Well, the position that's the mainstream position that I'm criticizing, and what that's often referred to by its critics is the household fallacy. And that's the idea that the government is like a household, that it has an income and expenditure, that if it spends more than it receives in income, it will go broke, and there will be a whole bunch of trouble for the government. And this is the fallacy is that the reason this is a fallacy is because the government has a printing press. So the simplest way we can imagine the problem being solved is the $1 trillion coin example. So the idea is that the government is running up all this debt. The government's, this was discussed during the Obama administration when there was a conflict over raising the debt ceiling, which is something that constantly happens because the government is constantly growing its overall historical debt. And so what was happening was that the Republicans weren't letting Obama, make his raise the debt ceiling and take on more debt. And so they looked at, and they found that to print a ceremonial coin, to mint a coin, the president doesn't need congressional or doesn't need approval of the legislature, right? So what they did was the suggestion was that Obama should order the mint to print $1 trillion coin, which could then be paid into a bank, and the US government would be out of debt, and we could keep going. And the point of this, this is a sort of simplified example, but to some extent, this is already what happens. Like, all money is made up, right? And there are rules about how it's made up. And if we actually look at those rules with a little bit of clarity, we can probably change our perspective. Now, the issue is then, so if the government has a printing press and can therefore sort of get defy gravity in terms of spending, what is the upper limit? Why doesn't it just spend until everybody's a millionaire? And the reason is that you cannot buy something that's not for sale. So the amount of money at a certain time, when too much money enters the economy, you get inflation, right? And now this is what the government tends to do to manage inflation, is use the Reserve Bank, right? This is why I've got Michael to give us a little sort of report on what the Australian Reserve Bank has been up to. And the basic principle is that the government will lower, the Reserve Bank will lower interest rates to increase lending, and that increases the supply of money, right? And when government borrows and spends, that's kind of the only other way that you can get money into the economy. Now, basically, the position that a lot of people, myself included, take is that all this private credit creation builds up a kind of pressure in the system, which can be released either through a crash or by the government sort of matching it in spending. So if the government spends into the economy, it creates money that's not part of the financial bubble, and that can help ease things. But anyhow, the point is that the central bank will lower interest rates when it wants to, when it's worried that inflation is too low. And at the moment, they're at the lowest in history. So which tells us while inflation also remains low. So that's what that means, is the only thing left that should happen is the government spending should increase. So Michael, why don't you tell us what's actually happened with the Reserve Bank recently?
Okie doke. Well, this is just I've got a couple of notes here which I'll look at while I talk. But in terms of their inflation projection, which is, I guess, a key factor in terms of how they set interest rates, they're talking about 1% for 2021 and about 1.5% for 2022. As a result, they've now set the cash rate to 0.1%, and 3-year Australian government bonds also at 0.1%, so virtually zero. They're saying that they're going to probably hold that for at least 3 years, because they don't think inflation is going to get to their 2 to 3% target band before then. So basically, from a Reserve Bank point of view, we are looking at a highly flat economy so far as inflation and interest rates go. Now, the other side is that because the governments are now facing all the problems resulting from the coronavirus, what the Reserve Bank's doing in addition is going into a bond buying program. So what that means is that the Australian government and the state governments, who can't print money, are now offering bonds, and the Reserve Bank is standing behind them. So in effect, it is passing the money printing power to the states as well, at 0.1%. So it's costing the states virtually nothing to now borrow, and the Reserve Bank has agreed to fund at least up to $100 billion of borrowings at the moment, but also indicated that there really isn't a limit, that if there is needing to be more money, then they will actually buy those bonds. And the critical thing there is that they're trying to do a full of Swifty and saying that they are not financing government, because what they're doing is buying the bonds in the secondary market. And they say that gives them the power to turn off the tap, because they just have to stop buying bonds in the secondary market. But in effect, the government's issuing bonds to banks, and the banks are then just simply on selling them to the Reserve Bank or other parties who buy the bonds. So
this brings us back around to the question of whether the Reserve Bank is saying, oh, we can't just turn on the tap and give the government whatever money it needs to spend. So what happens instead is the government borrows to spend, and then when that debt is building up in the market, the Reserve Bank comes along after the fact and sort of cleans up the mess by printing money and buying the debt. And then the debt becomes debt owed from the Treasury to the Reserve Bank, which never matters.
That's right.
Right? It's just a historical record of how the transactions have occurred.
Smoke and mirrors, and it's purely so that the Reserve Bank can say, we are, quotes, independent from government. At any time, we can stop buying bonds. In other words, we're not printing at the behest of the government. And to a certain extent, that is true compared to, say, if you absolutely made that connection between the government and the Reserve Bank, where basically the government said to the Reserve Bank, you will print me $100 billion and you must do that. And then the Reserve Bank is forced to do it. Whereas this sort of separation of powers does give an independent Reserve Bank some ability to say, no, you're going too far, government. You can issue as many bonds as you like, but we're not standing behind you in the market. So good luck to you. Now,
well, what would take us through the thought experiment? What would happen in that situation? What would happen if the Reserve Bank didn't buy up the debt?
Okay.
Can you game that out a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I think it's a moot point. I think come the crunch, if the reason the government is raising the money is to keep the economy ticking over, then the Reserve Bank will step in. If, however, the government was being completely profligate, right, and it was financing schemes all over the country that was wildly pushing up demand for resources and crowding out the private sector and, you know, creating white elephants, then I can see the Reserve Bank standing back.
Oh, okay. There's two things I want to pick up on there. One is the overall tone of the conversation is very similar to what we always hear. We always hear, what if the government spends too much?
Yes.
Right? We very rarely hear, what if the government spends too little, except we sort of do implicitly hear it again and again when people talk about stimulus.
Yeah.
Right? We're seeing it now that if the government wasn't just dropping cash as stimulus to people have a sense that the whole economy would fall over.
Yeah.
Right? So what we can start to think about is now classical economists, like classical and neoclassical economists, tend to say that money doesn't matter, that money is a veil drawn over resources, over resource transactions, right? So really all money is, they're imagining the model of the economy is a market economy, like a market in, you know, ye olde England, and I've made a cartload of soap, and I bring my soap to the market, and someone else has got a cartload of, you know, I don't know, badger hats or whatever, right? And we've got to figure out how many pieces of soap is worth one badger hat. But rather than doing that, you know, we have all the goods being compared against all the other goods via some medium, which is, you know, coins or whatever, which is scarce and durable, and therefore a good stock and value, and a good way of comparing the value of different items. And so therefore government spending and banking, they have their descriptions of that of government spending and banking kind of curtailed by, or sort of hamstrung by, this assumption. And so what Keynes did is he came along and we said, want an investment and production economy. So we imagine that you need money first before you can make the soap, right? You need to build the soap factory first, right? You need to buy a gun and some land to shoot badgers on, or whatever it is. And so that means where money comes into the economy matters, and where it flows matters. And so a lot of what we're saying is very similar to what is called modern monetary theory, but where Michael and I and a growing group of other people tend to differ from modern monetary theory is their focus on a jobs guarantee. And the idea is that they say, we've got all this extra spending, we can use it to do these great things, you know, build parks and have community vegetable gardens and whatever the idea happens to be. Plus, we'll guarantee a job for everybody, and that's way we'll make sure that everybody gets a slice. Whereas with the basic income people, we say, well, let's just start with everybody getting the money, and then that'll create a bunch of jobs anyhow, because people will spend it. And so it's about imagining, if you at the moment, what's happening with the Reserve Bank and the financial sector is debt, financial money creation by the banks is through the roof, right? But it's not it's leading to high stock prices, to higher housing prices, but it's not leading to a sort of strong and vibrant economic recovery. And what we're saying is that's because the money doesn't circulate through the economy; it stays in the financial sector. So what if we just moved it to the to the population is where the money sort of comes into the system. And then you see a sort of reorientation of the thing. Does anybody have a question at this stage?
I was just going to ask, where does this money kind of end up usually? Is this where all the construction spending?
Well, this is the question. I mean, when it leaves the banking system, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, construction spending, infrastructure spending. So the New South Wales government is spending $100 billion on infrastructure alone, right? And so this is all debt financed, right? And so it's like the coronavirus, in a sense, has given them an excuse to do this, and they can say there's been this external shock. But what about 2008, when there was no external trigger? It was a purely financial crisis. So what I think, and I'll get and see what Michael thinks about this, is that to an extent, coronavirus may be making the economic situation better because it's giving the governments an excuse to do the money creation / debt spending that they need to do. And if they didn't have that political cover, we may have had the bubble burst anyhow, the debt bubble burst, and we wouldn't have that political cover for the governments to do the right thing. Michael, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, look, I think that you're right, that the fact that so many people all at once lost their jobs have given the government sort of an out, because when the individuals lose their job, it's a really traumatic event, but each individual loses their jobs in very different circumstances. And so you can say, well, it's all their fault. But the trauma is no less when you sum up all those individual people to 5% of the economy, then the additional 5% who happen to have lost their jobs all for the same reason. And the fact that it's all for the same reason and all at the same time is what gives this the appearance of something different. But in fact, if the 5% who lost it all due to the virus need a certain amount of money to live, that's just as true as the 5% who individually lost their jobs. And at the moment, that connection isn't being made either by the government or the community. It's as though the people who have lost their jobs through the coronavirus need special help because they were the workers, they were the people adding value, and yet the people who are in the 5% normally unemployed, they're not a group of people who are there for 20 years all grifting off the state. They're there for 6 weeks, 6 months, tops 2 years for most of them, and they're back at work. So they're all exactly the same people who have lost their jobs as those who lost them in this current crisis. And so, yes, I agree with you, Austin. It's given the government an out, but nobody's yet really making the connection between the existing unemployment who need money and hence the basic income.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, one thing that Stephen said was, where does that money end up, right?
Yeah.
And he meant in terms of where does it sort of come into the economy? So it comes in. So, I mean, and the government, for example, had specifically a thing which was $25,000 for towards renovations if you were spending $150,000 on renovations. So people who were actually contributed to me and my wife getting evicted because the landlord wanted to do the renovations. So he didn't renew our lease. Anyhow, it's fine. But it worked out for the best. We're in a better, a nicer spot. But the point is that so it went towards housing, and it also went towards the other place it went is people buying stocks. So the stock market had a crash, but then it got really high again because there was all this. People thought, well, it's really low, and I'll borrow money and I'll buy because interest rates are low. So it only needs to grow at a tiny rate. The stock price only needs to rebound slowly to overcome to be more than the interest on my loan. And so everybody did that, so the prices went back up. Yeah.
What are they buying stocks with?
It's called they're borrowing. People who have assets can therefore get loans, and therefore they borrow, and the interest rate is 0.1% from the Reserve Bank. So I don't know what banks are lending at now, but people can get money quite cheap, and then they buy stocks, and it's called, a leveraged investment. And the stock market is being held up by that. And the thing is, the reason, and so is housing, because housing isn't counted in inflation. And when you first hear that, it sounds like it's not fair, because it's part of the cost of living, right? And that's it's a cost of living expense, but it's not counted in the consumer price index. And I actually start to think that there's a good reason for that. It's because housing is an asset. It's not something that you use up. It's this store of wealth. So it's going with the stock market. House prices are going up. The stock price is going up. Assets are going up. So people are parking their money in assets, and it's not circulating in the economy. So that's why you have a high stock market and high unemployment at the same time. The question we could ask is increasing employment actually our long-term goal? I don't think so, but we can still accept it as an indicator of the economy, of the health of the economy, given the economy's current sort of setup. Okay, I've got another thing I was going to quote here. I circulated an article in the thing, in case anybody wanted to read up. I don't know if anybody did, but what I'll just do is I'll read the last two paragraphs of the article that I shared, which was about government spending and this sort of stuff, right? So it also had this graph in it where you can see this massive spike where the deficit was huge in the Second World War, right? I go, consider the explosion of prosperity and technological progress that came out of the Second World War. This wasn't despite the governments involved running huge deficits. It was because of this. And there's no reason we can't mobilize the economy in a similar degree towards goals other than the destruction of an external enemy, raising living standards or transitioning to sustainable technologies, for example. Consider also the collapse and depression which preceded that war, which was actually a deflationary spiral, the likes of which we risk repeating if we refuse to move beyond a stubbornly stupid and simplistic view of money, debt, and government. Now, this is the other point I wanted to make, is people will always talk about the risk of inflation, whereas constant low inflation is actually the goal of most economists. What you really don't want is deflation. Deflation is what a deflationary spiral looks like, is the Great Depression, and that's what we're sort of on the knife edge of at the moment. And the governments know this, and that's why you're seeing this continuous top up. But there's the danger that, in the US now, when you've got this transition occurring, that both sides are just going to be, going to be more interested in blocking the other side, and that no deal will get done. And so this is a situation in which some kind of basic we need more government spending, not less. And so the question becomes, not can we afford a basic income, right? But how much basic income can we afford before we start to hit that inflationary cap? And this is where I know Michael has a similar proposal to advocates a similar course of action to what I do, and what other people in what I like to call the consumer monetary theory school. Not everyone in the group uses that title, but I use it for basically everyone who likes MMT but doesn't like the jobs guarantee and wants a basic income instead. And what's advocated is that you start with a small amount alongside all the existing welfare payments, and you gradually increase that. So Michael, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, one of the ways that we can introduce the UBI is as a pilot, and every other pilot around the world has been done either by some geographic area or a group of people, and often it's targeted at people who have low incomes or no incomes, and so it's not really a genuine UBI. And then people criticize the pilots because either the results are inconclusive or something. So, but one way to do a genuine pilot is to literally give everybody, to start with, a small amount of money every single week. And that has two benefits. One is it actually tests the reliability of the system, because we have to be able to get money to every single person who is entitled to it, and at the same time ensure people who are not entitled to it get double the money or whatever. So everybody gets their entitlement every week. And we can then also see what are the economic and social impacts of giving this money to people. So at $10 a week, most people in Australia would probably say, yeah, that's not going to make any difference. My wife, not my wife, my daughter works with people who are in disadvantaged situations, and she tells me $10 a week, especially for a couple, that's $20 a week, would make a huge difference to some people. It's the petrol money just to get to a casual job or food for the day. And so while it wouldn't affect most people, it would right from the start give some benefit. And then what we can do is see that, okay, the world hasn't fallen apart. There's not massive inflation. People aren't suddenly on drugs or sitting in basements playing video games.
So how quickly would you phase it up?
Stephen, I'd recommend over 10 years, and that might sound like a long time, but I'm 71 and I can tell you it's not a long time. And what that does is you could do it quarter by quarter to get to what is the equivalent of a bit above the poverty line now, $500 a week per person. So $1,000 a couple.
Michael, do you mind if I jump in? I agree with most of that.
Yeah.
But what I would suggest is, first of all, that you don't want to set either a timeline or a maximum or a goal amount as such.
Yeah.
Like, you can have the goal of that you definitely want it to be above the poverty line,
Yes.
but you wouldn't necessarily want that to be the end goal, because you can imagine it being introduced now as a what you could call a rolling stimulus or a modulated stimulus, right? And the reason I use the term modulated or calibrated, right? This is what Alex Howard talks about, calibrated basic income.
Yes.
And the whole idea is that we're moving away for a second from looking at it as a point of how does this solve the problem of all these individuals have, and saying, how does this affect the broader economy, right? And that actually, so one way you can ask the question is, like, why is the right amount of passive income for people zero? Would it be better if it was a negative amount? So if everyone had a head tax that they had to pay the government, if everyone had a negative income, a negative basic income of $10 a week, would that make the economy better or worse, right? And if we think it would we don't think it would make the economy better, we can say, well, what if we move $10 in the opposite direction, away from zero, right? There's no reason that the default is what the best amount is any particular spot, right? So what I would say you would adjust it more frequently than quarterly, especially if you're introducing it now, because you could say it's this rolling stimulus.
There's two criteria, I guess. One is ultimately the inflation rate and the current employment, which I'll come back to the issue of employment separately to address your concerns, Austin, about bullshit jobs, right? But from an inflation point of view, certainly, there's nothing to stop us putting in money faster while we monitor the inflation rate. And if the money's going in and inflation is not taking off, and people, as I say, are not getting into straits, then we should go on increasing it. The only reason
I'm going to come in there, if you don't mind. So this is exactly the approach of the calibrated basic income. So I've got to get Michael and this guy Alex Howell in the conversation one time. You'll be entirely in sync. But what I like to point out is that when you do, if you start with a low basic income and you raise it, then you start to see inflation. You don't actually have to stop raising the basic income, because it's not the only inflationary lever. Then you can look at, for example, interest rates. And one thing you people do to control interest rates is raise inflation, because it slows the flow of money from the financial sector into the economy, right?
Raise interest rates.
Raise interest rates. The central bank could raise interest rates, and that might give us more headroom to further increase spending. And if we hit the limit of that, and okay, interest rates are getting a little high, and the basic income still less than we would like it to be for other reasons, then we can say, well, we could stop, or we could look at other inflationary levers, which include taxes. So we can, if we tax the upper middle class and the wealthy more, we're sucking more money out of the economy. That creates more space for a basic income to come in, because it means, so we have all these other levers as well, and basic income becomes one of these inflationary levers that either the central bank or the government can operate. I don't think it makes that much difference whether the central bank is part of the government, or whether, in most circumstances, or whether it's got this nominal independence, if they're both run by the same economic theory. Well, right? If they're both in either case, if they're all working from the same assumptions and they have the same equations that they're working with, they're going to be able to predict each other's behavior.
I see it a little bit differently there, in that if we let the central bank manage the money supply in order to manage the universal basic income and the broad parameters of the economy, like inflation and unemployment. And so you said to the central bank, you have to manage that. The government then is left to say, what do we as a society want to do from a policy perspective, and what's that going to cost? Now, theoretically, if the money is flowing into the community through the UBI, and people are borrowing in order to finance activity, including the government, then there ought to be the money available for people to pay in taxes to the government for approved programs. Now, there's for and against. What the for is there is that it forces the government to sell the proposition to the community, which they don't usually do very well, right? But ideally, they should be in a position to say, we want to do this, and will you, the community, contribute to it, in which case it demonstrates.
But what if, hold on a sec. But that implies a cost which may not be there, right? If there's untapped capacity sitting around in the economy, right? Yeah. And what we need to do is put more money in
circulation, then I would prefer that to
mobilize
by UBI, right? I would prefer to always, if there's
I see it, because you're saying
lift up everybody else and let them spend their money and pay their taxes to decide what it is that the community as a whole produces. The more we put it into central power, the more likely you're going to get, pork barreling and all that sort of stuff. That's all.
Yeah, which we're seeing in New South Wales at the moment. Look, I like to think that hopefully we can clean up politics to get rid of that kind of overt corruption anyhow. And I do worry about this idea that, we need to get the central bank away from the government, when after all, the government is elected, right?
Yeah.
We did. And so what's the check on them? I'd say it's the population, and the population can say this government is being foolish and spending too much money. Well, I mean, it's so then we have this idea of, a temple of technocrats somewhere, self-selecting population of experts who actually end up running the economy. I think we should see if we can get someone else into the conversation for a little bit, because you and I have been kind of hogging it. But do you want to? Does anybody else want to jump in at this point? I saw a couple of questions in the chat from Rini H. If Australia had a basic income where everyone had a simple payment, would be mostly spent and go back to the economy, similar to what happened with the recent short-term virus supplement. And that's exactly right. And the thing is that we've got the federal government planning on dropping that supplement in the payment, and that we will see in the coming weeks and coming months, whether the other spending, the infrastructure spending and that the states are rolling out and stuff, is enough to counteract that. Again, thinking from a macroeconomic perspective, not the perspective of an individual, and is it enough for them? Reni's also asked in a chat that I think was just sent to me rather than the rest of the group, so you might not see it, is why have it universal? And I think we probably covered that in other talks in terms of the administrative issues and the sort of anxiety it causes with that people know it could be taken away. But as I would say, that's probably more of a rabbit hole than we want to go down at the moment, because we're sort of trying to focus on this monetary stuff. But does anybody else want to respond about the universality question to Rini?
Well, I'd just like to put in the point that what you raised before about using taxes to offset inflation, that in fact, if you combine a flat percentage tax on all spending, right? So that includes to buy houses, assets, every single dollar that gets spent, if the same rate of tax is applied for everybody, but everybody gets a flat amount, then what you do is you turn the combined UBI plus the flat tax into a progressive tax system. Because in the end, the people who are spending most money end up paying net tax, and the people at the bottom, while they do pay some tax, they're getting a net benefit through the UBI. And so
yeah,
two things combined actually allow you to do a universal payment.
Okay. I don't like the idea of taxing consumption, because rich
not
people,
just consumption, everything.
Yeah. Okay. It's like more like a VAT, like what Andrew Yang proposed.
Well, no, VAT is not so good, because it means that the people in the production chain have to pay the tax themselves, right? Whereas what I'm talking about is it would be like a GST, but like a GST on everything. You buy a house for 800,000.
Yeah. I don't like the idea of consumption taxes like that, because they actually have on its own, if you don't factor the UBI in, if you count that separately, it's regressive.
Yeah, but that's right.
Right. So
you have to put them together. Have to put them together.
Yes, but you can also put a UBI together with a progressive taxation system, which, and I want to jump to what.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah. I want to jump to Rini again. She said, my fundamental issue with it being universal is the ultra rich get it when they absolutely don't need it. Now, I say my response to that would be, the reason we give it to the ultra rich is the same reason that we give them access to public roads, the same reason we give them access to public libraries, the same reason the children of the ultra rich can go to school at a public school and not have to pay the exorbitant fees at a private school if they want, because it is part of the national infrastructure. It is, and the reason I would pair it with if I was pairing it with a tax, I would pair it with a progressive income tax increase. So you can imagine, if I'm on 100,000 a year, and then through my basic income I get another 20,000 on top of that, right? If my taxes go up by 21,000 at the same time, then overall I'm 1,000 worse off, right? But that means, so if you can adjust the progressive taxation rate to address inequality, and you have basic income there as this universal payment, because this is the question: is it more troublesome that a rich person gets it who doesn't need it, or that a poor person who does need it misses out, right? Which is more upsetting, that Gina Reinhardt gets an extra $2,000 a month or whatever that she's not going to notice, or that someone who is in need is, that children are growing up in, a household where the financial stress dominates their parents' lives, right? Like, which is the bigger problem? And if the problem is that these people get too much, well, it's like, what they if you're worried about them getting another $1,000 for free, imagine you'll hate to hear what they get in tax breaks at the moment, right? Like, this is not the $1,000 isn't going to meaningfully that Gina Reinhardt gets doesn't meaningfully change the position in terms of inequality. So the way to go after inequality, I would say, is with taxation. Basic income does something else. It provides this sort of, and what it can also do, it will dramatically reduce the wealth of the ultra wealthy, because the asset bubbles that we've got around, these huge stock prices, huge real estate prices, that's a result of the cheap money from the central bank. So at the moment, don't get mad about them getting $1,000. Get mad about them getting basically everything. You know, I say when I was renting recently, if that when I finished my term, I was renting recently. There was a dispute about the how much to pay for the cleaning, right? Because I thought they drastically overcharged us, basically taking all of our bond to clean the place after we'd already cleaned it, and blah blah blah. And people were telling me I should make a stink about it, and I said, yeah, look, that's like $1,000 or something now that I'm fighting about. But let's not forget that this guy's made $60,000 off me over the last few years, right? Don't lose sight of the bigger picture. And you know, if you want to get mad at the wealthy, there's bigger amounts to talk about. Josh.
Yeah, there's a fair bit of discussion happening in the chat. I just thought I'd remind people that there is an option to raise your hand in the participant section if you aren't showing your video. Otherwise, you can just raise your hand in the video. I just thought I'd shout that out.
Either physically raised hands or digitally raised hands will get responded to. Okay, the name I've got for you is Galaxy.
Hi, it's Barbara. Oh, I can't hear you either.
Hi, Barbara. Sorry.
I just asked the question about if you wanted to take tax out, what about taking it out of bank?
Paradise, the Chinese developer locking beaches and asking tourists and local.
Sorry, go on.
Take a tax out when it was in a bank account, when a payment was made, when you bought something and used your bank account, that there would be a tax taken out then if the tax was needed.
Transaction tax.
Yeah, well, virtually a transaction tax, but I mean it would be caused by a transaction. But there was a suggestion at one point that if we all paid 0.5%, we'd equal what the taxable revenue was, and that was a few years ago. I guess if it was right then, it'd be just as right now. But it might not be such a bad idea.
I'm not sure if that's how Michael. How similar is that to what you're suggesting?
It's what it can be done if we think about income, right? So let's say you're getting $100 in income, and you're going to pay 20% tax, income tax, right? That will leave you $80 to spend. So if you spend your whole $100, you're going to spend $80 and then pay $20 in tax. So whether it's taken out at the time you earn it or the time you spend it makes no difference to the total amount of tax paid. It changes the percentage. It goes from being 20% of income to 25% of spending, but it's exactly the same. So if everybody got their income tax-free, what Barbara says is quite right. If every single person had bank accounts that were tied to them and they all received their income completely tax-free, then you could have a rule that says anytime you spend or take money out of that account, the tax comes out and it's 20% of the income, 25%.
Suggestion.
Well, half a percent may not do it, Barbara, because
I'm just saying that's what the story was.
No, that's right. The issue really is that GDP in total tax currently is about 30% of GDP. So, and if we take GDP as our national income, being the sum total of all our individual incomes, which is not quite right, but it's good enough for the idea. That means that all of us together are paying about 30% of our income in tax to all the state and local and federal authorities totally. Now we pay it in bits and pieces. We pay it in corporate tax and payroll tax and income tax and all sorts of taxes. But if we grossed it all up, it's around about 30%. And so if all of us got our royalties and our fees and our wages, if everybody got that tax-free, paid straight into our bank account, we could then have the basic rule, 30% of the income as you spend it then goes off
Yeah.
to...
But then you're compounding, I think, some inequality that we already have in our economy. Josh?
Well,
Yeah, I
then
question
pay the UBI to get rid of the inequality, right? In other words, the UBI...
Hold on, I'll just respond to Michael before he said. I would say the opposite, that we use the UBI to supply the economy with the money it needs, and then we use taxes to deal with inequality. That's why I would say that, so you want a progressive taxation system that taxes most from the rich and least from the poor, so that and if you bring in these tax changes and the UBI together, there is not necessarily a net increase. There may be a net decrease for the income of the Gina Reinhardts of the world and so on, as Rini was raising before. Josh, did you have something to add?
I challenge whether we want to be taxing income or wealth, because if we're taxing income, then a billionaire who doesn't make any income wouldn't be taxed. And I feel like we're targeting the wrong thing if we're taxing income. And my preferred kind of tax would be something that I haven't seen anywhere, but effectively you'd, so say you were to tax land, because you think some people are hoarding too much land. You figure out how much would be if Australia was to be split into equal pieces and everybody was to have an equal piece, if somebody has more than that amount, then you tax them to say effectively that you can't take more than your fair share of that countries.
I admire that principle,
favorite.
but I think this land thing is a bit crazy because different bits of land are worth different amounts, right? It's more about the water that's on them or the access to other infrastructure or something like that than the square footage.
Sure.
So I mean
not land
the
specifically, just assets. I'm saying just
okay.
generally.
Yeah.
Land
Ownership.
value tax.
But here's I want to talk a little bit about the billionaire example, because this is where this alternative view gets a little interesting and not so and where it's not necessarily just oh wow, the left was right all along, and we should just tax the billionaires. Here's one of the things that this subscribes to is what's called it's the income theory of it's the income that matters and the expenditure. So what matters is whether the spending in the economy is using up all the resources that are available to be spent on all of the goods and services and so forth, right? So we talk about the billionaire. Let's take the Elon Musk example, who doesn't have much cash and is paid a symbolic salary of $1 from Tesla or whichever is 5 companies it is, right? What he owns is this huge stake in all of these companies, these assets. What that really is power, rather than actual money that he can tap into. So as long as it's tied up in shares, he's not using that money to make claims on the economy. So then when Bill Gates did this recently, actually liquidates some of his cash, of his shares, and uses it to buy a super yacht, then he's drawing on the real resources of the economy. But when it's sitting there in because the real resource of the economy is in engineers, steel, staff to man the yacht, he's actually using real things. That's when the spending matters, right? So the argument goes that sure, if the reason you tax someone like Elon Musk or Bill Gates is more because you don't like the amount of power they have over the economy, that they have that rather than that they are accessing that we need the money. It's not that we need the money. It's not that we need the money and there's the place to go get it. Because first of all, like if Elon Musk sold all his shares tried to sell all his shares at once, right, the value of those shares would collapse. It's not there like a pile of gold that they can dig into. It's this sort of it's this suspended disbelief values that all of these companies have, right? The point is that it's actually when money enters the economy and starts making a claim on real resources that it affects how much we can spend elsewhere. So actually, a billionaires with their money in an offshore tax haven, that might be something that we think is abhorrent and wrong and unfair, but it's got very little to do with the amount that we can actually spend. Because if they take that money and they stash it away in stocks or in the Cayman Islands, right? Then that means that they're not spending it on actual stuff, on cars and electricity and doodads. So whether they then lose, if they then lose it because the Cayman Islands seizes their funds, or if they lose it in the stock market because the stock market crashes, that's actually good news. That doesn't mean, oh, that money's gone, now we can't tax it. That means that the space has been opened up in the economy for more spending, and we can increase the basic income.
There's another way to sort of characterize it too, is to think about two different types of billionaires. So we might think of a wealthy person who works 14, 16 hours a day in a business that produces, say, high quality footwear. And they pay their workers really well. They live in a very modest house, but they're worth hundreds of millions or billions. And in some respects,
hold on a sec. I want to.
Right, Warren Buffett lives in a very modest home, doesn't drive a flashy car. His cars are 10 years old or whatever, and so he lives a very modest life personally. But he controls hundreds of billions of dollars worth of resources, and you could say, well, he's the controlling mind. If it wasn't him, who would be the control? And so what you're talking about is switching the controlling mind. And most entrepreneurs, if they are working to service their customers and not defraud them, are actually providing a service to the community. The trouble is sometimes there's monopoly power, there's fraud, and the commons isn't paid for. But it's a very complicated situation just to broadly characterize wealth as being bad in itself, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, look, what I'm trying to avoid in this particular discussion group is too much of the moral question.
Yeah.
Right? It always creeps in, right? But we just want to talk about what are the macroeconomic effects. And so what are the macroeconomic effects of having these billionaires? And in fact, they're kind of places that where money goes to die to an extent, because it goes out of the real economy and gets locked up in, like, $1 that's spent on stock price that goes into the stock market doesn't go into a small business or into expenditure or into building something real, right? It may go into it, like a dollar that goes into real estate might be speculative, but at least we get the real estate, right? But especially with the thing about real estate is then wages would get paid. But with the stock market, the money just goes there and just sits there, which is why we have this deflationary issue, because the money's going straight from the banks to the stock markets. That's why we have this position that you described at the beginning of the talk, with the Reserve Bank being unable to create inflation and wanting the government, and so that the government and the states are already stepping in and doing all this spending, and we don't know if it's going to be enough. And this is the other great thing about a basic income, and that if it's used in this macroeconomic way, is that it can sort of fill the difference, right? And what so it starts out as something that just sort of tops up the economy to actually access all of the stuff that's available and prevent deflation. And the point I'm trying to make is that whether you tax a billionaire or not is kind of a separate question to whether you can afford the basic income, and we can calibrate. We can actually decouple the two things, right? One of the great things I like about a basic income is it decouples a bunch of stuff in the economy. So at the moment, wages and spending are the same thing, more or less, right? Or they should be, and the difference is made up by debt, right? And so that means we have this problem where we're trying to get the economy going, and the way so what we do, instead of giving people money to spend at the moment, we lend to businesses so they'll hire people. Then the people who are hired will spend the money, right? So we're trying to throw money at people via the business world and the financial world, rather than just give it to them directly. And so you can imagine it. A great analogy I heard recently was by the authors of a book called Money from Nothing. I forget what they were called, but the analogy is, if you want to understand basic income as a monetary tool, think about a car's engine, right? And for people who know about cars, this makes sense. A carburetor is the old-fashioned way. With the carburetor, it just spins, and it mixes the oxygen and the fuel through the motion of the engine itself, causes the carburetor to spin and mix the oxygen and the fuel at a sort of reasonable rate to keep the engine turning. Modern cars have a fuel injection system, so they put exactly the right amount of oxygen and exactly the right amount of fuel in each cylinder, right? A basic income is moving, so you decouple things and you do things independently, and you can actually achieve the right macroeconomic balance, and that's the sort of policy vision of basic income as a macroeconomic tool. Now, hopefully, it gets and this is what we believe, I believe anyhow, is that very soon you'll see that it actually gets above the poverty line in less than 10 years, right? Because the actual capacity of the question is, what is the actual capacity of our economy to deliver goods and services? And until you hit that limit, that's when you won't have those negative side effects of inflation. So the question is, do we have enough actual stuff in the economy for us to not have anyone live in poverty? And the answer, I think, is obviously yes. So getting the money, and the reason it wouldn't work is because people go, oh, I've got this basic income now, I don't want to work anymore, and stop making stuff. But I think that risk is overstated.
Yeah, there's two things. The basic income gives you the ability to signal to the market what you need, right? So instead of queuing up in a food line run by the salvos, you go down the shops and you buy it, right? That's one side of the equation, but on the supply side,
unlike with the salvos, your purchase then triggers in production and investment and the expansion of capacity of the thing you just bought. Whereas if it's outside of the market, it may not do that.
Well, yeah, it just increases demand for charity services. But the shops are a perfectly good distribution network. The only thing that's missing is the money to be able to signal what you need. And that's been proven absolutely through the payment of JobKeepers, right? My daughter, as I said, works in welfare, and the numbers of people coming to get food when the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker payments were increased actually fell. So despite more people being out of work, less people came looking for food vouchers because they had the money to spend. Poverty
fell in Australia during the coronavirus crisis, right?
Yeah.
Because the payments to the people at the bottom were increased.
Yeah.
And notice that we did that, and we still have deflationary, not inflationary pressures.
Yeah.
Right? So that means that we've got the capacity to eliminate poverty and go beyond that through cash transfers before we hit an inflationary ceiling. And, we can test it in a fairly safe way, but you're gone.
And so I was going to say, one of the things that we need to think about, while you're correct that in terms of how we can actually afford more, by characterizing it in a more steady fashion, we are able to, I think, bring more people on board who might be nervous. Politicians, economists even, who don't fully comprehend what's available, business people. If we do it in a staged way, then people will see the evidence. And as they see the evidence after 2 or 3 years, then we can say, well, look, maybe we could speed this thing up. Right? Because it actually is proving to drop crime, to improve health, to improve
then you have the numbers.
Business, and you've got the numbers, right? You're no longer arguing about theory. And my concern with going too far too quickly is we just get pushback. Right.
Whereas, what I would say is that the best thing to say is, well, we're going to hand it. This is a great time to use the independence of the central bank and say, here are the parameters by which it'll be calculated. Or you have like the Fair Work Commission. You have a quasi-independent group that adjusts it and I would say at more regular base a bit at the start, because we're using it to counteract the coronavirus. But I want to go to Barbara. She put her hand up a little while ago. And after Barbara, I think David wanted to say something. But Barbara, you go ahead. And then we'll get to you, Josh.
When we're looking at how much money people have, we had people who were not Australian citizens, people who were on casual wages that hadn't been employed for 12 months. We had all those sorts of people who had to find a food bank so that they wouldn't starve, and they had to somehow find some rent money. And I think for Australians to not look after people like the foreign students, for an example, they go from providing Australia with $24 billion a year to not having enough food to eat. I think it was rather rude of Australia not to look after them.
Absolutely agree, Barbara. Absolutely agree.
And the other thing is the casual work, that's insecure work, as Dan Andrews has taken steps to make that happen, to reduce the sickness benefit part of it for casual employees. And casual work is an obscenity. I work personally. I mean, I've had all sorts of different things in my life. I'm a bit old and rusty. I've been in small business. I've worked for a wage, and I've worked for in a casual employment situation for over 10 years. And I was working full time and then some. I worked 7 days a week on casual money, and still got done. So you know, like all of a sudden in December, when it got close to Christmas, it was a case of, we'll call you back in January if there's any work, or, you know, like when the work starts in January, here's a letter, go to Centrelink and get some money in the meantime. So it's all, it's insecure, it's obscene. And when you consider that it's also a lazy way, and there's the other thing too about people insinuating themselves in between a profession like nurses, and they are doing the wage thing for a whole group of nurses, and they decide where the nurse goes to work, and it's the nurse gets casual money, and these people have insinuated themselves in between the nurse and the hospital, and it just means that the scheduling of nurses is not done. It's, you know, it's not efficient. The hospital
I think this is good. There's a couple of things going on there. One of them would be this sort of kind of a little bit off topic, but I agree with you. There's also been a kind of stealth privatization of much of the health services, where individual hospitals are contracting out services rather than just providing them as the hospital employing people. So the hospital rents, you know, uses an agency to supply labor rather than those people being direct employees of the state government, which I think is
can't really be that it's cheaper to do that. It's got to cost more than if the hospital was directly employing the nurse, and perhaps, God forbid, having a half a nurse extra on duty that day.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is all part of the. I think they probably do end up saving money by sort of, you know, squeezing the nurses but like toothpaste, right? By having them go. Whereas if they had them all employed by the state government, they'd probably be more vulnerable to industrial action. There'd probably be all kinds of. So I mean, what you're seeing here is there's this overall reduction in labor power in the markets, and this might be a good time to talk about what's the effect of a basic income on the labor market. And it's often presented as this: oh, the rich are using it as they want to lower everyone's wages and have, you know, everyone live on a basic income so they don't have to pay good wages. Okay, right?
Can I just drop one in between?
Yeah, sure.
In there, if you consider the actual prison system, which sounds a bit out of left field or something, but if you consider the actual prison system, the prisons are being run, and I believe it's by an overseas company. Prison systems are being run by that company employing the guards and everything else's, and it's also the same company that builds the prisons and decides on population, etc., how many new prisons we're going to need, and they get the kudos to build the next prison. And if you consider the Australian Aboriginals are getting overrepresented in prisons, if that were a government situation where they were being a little bit more quibbling about how much money they were going to spend, instead of this private business deciding how many prisons they were going to have, because more prisons.
Yeah, look, I think that's a direct that's a real issue. Privatization is an issue, and we could do one of these talks where we discuss privatization and how it relates to a basic income, because one of the things that gets there are right wingers who propose, well, let's have a basic income and then marketize all the public services, and we could do a whole talk about that. But I don't want to go too far into the privatization issue right now, because it really would take, we could do a whole hour just on that. David, you unmuted a couple of times. Did you have something you wanted to add and didn't get a chance to say it, or I didn't, or was that, are you good? Well, he's not unmuting now.
Hello.
Oh, David, hey, great, go ahead.
I'm just content mostly to listen. The only comment I wanted to make, when someone said before about the job seeker, I'm here in Adelaide with the Anti-Poverty Network SA. Anyway, we basically represent the unemployed and the people on Centrelink payments, and definitely, yeah, the having the boost for job seeker this year has made an amazing difference to so many low-income people, and it's just unbelievable that now the government's going to take all that away gradually. Some more in December and then again in March. So,
so David, I'm gonna.
Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I want to leave it.
Yeah,
to
no,
you.
look, David, I want to say something which I think is a little bit cynical, but probably accurate. Is that the government didn't actually really want to help all those people who are in poverty so much. It's just that it had to prevent the macroeconomy from falling over. And that's where we've got this weird situation where they only do the right thing when they absolutely have to. Any excuse not to end poverty, right? So we've got to ask ourselves about the ideology there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Similar to what you're saying, my cynical approach would be that they put in the coronavirus supplement for the job seeker payment because you had all these hundreds of thousands of extra, people, becoming unemployed, and so for those new unemployed, oh, we better make sure that they see us in a good light or somewhat. But for the people that were already on the hundreds of thousands that were already on it before coronavirus, they're not really concerned so much about them. And I know they definitely don't have a commitment to empowering the poor. That's for sure.
I think part of it is that yes, they were like, oh, what? Now there are real people on unemployment as well, not just those non-people that we've been demonizing for decades. But I think it's also a matter of that, like, it's when they knew that they needed to get money into the hands of people who would spend it as well. So anyhow, let's go. We've got Josh and Stephen both have their hands up. So we'll go Josh, then Stephen.
Yeah, so we've kind of changed topics a little bit, but I just wanted to, we were talking about the trial and the phase in and whether it should be gradually increased. And I just had one thought, because I know that, Michael, your perspective is strategic. And I will just say, I think I agree with you on just about everything. I will say the one concern with a gradual rollout or a slower rollout is that it gives more opportunity for people to sabotage it, which we've seen a lot of in trials overseas, where people will, like the opposition parties will manipulate the data and they will try and do things to stop it.
But
I just thought I'd raise that.
I think it's a good point, and that's why having it universal and simple makes it very, very hard, to manipulate the numbers because it is universal. And the other thing is that if everybody's getting it, then you're taking away something from everybody if you're going to dispense with it. So as it grows more and more, it becomes harder and harder, in fact, to negate it. You would have to prove to
which is an argument, which is surely an argument for growing it quickly so that the effects are bigger and harder to fudge. But
can I just say,
Stephen?
I just have one quick thing
Josh,
to say.
then Stephen.
Maybe I'm giving ammunition to our enemies, but one example of a way you could sabotage it is as it's being slowly rolled out. So let's say everybody's got $10 a week. You start hiring people to commit crimes. And therefore, the result that we wanted, where there was a lower crime rate, it looks like, oh shoot, we've got a whole bunch of extra crimes. So, I mean, you know,
Yeah, I mean, come on, though. That's like that's some next level
I'm just
Marvel
saying.
movie.
I'm just
So
saying.
it's a plot. It's a good plot for a Marvel movie, right? You know what I mean? And then Batman's going
Things
to fight all
happen.
the criminals and save the basic income.
I've got no doubt that some sneaky person could endeavour to do that. I guess the difficulty would be is that demonstrating that Australia-wide. And again, that's another benefit of having it universal, because you might be able to do that in a suburb or a city or somewhere, but you are not going to be able to do that Australia-wide. And so if somebody then turns around and says, hang on, what the hell's going on here? Again, I just think universal, small, and I'm with you, Austin. If we can do it faster, let's do it faster, but let's not hang our hat on having to go.
Well, here's the thing. What I would say is let's not set ourselves the goal of doing it fast or doing it slow. What you do is you set the Reserve Bank or some independent body I think the Fair Work Commission is a good example of the kind of body that could organize it, except that they would have to be making adjustments on a quicker scale if we want it to work as a stimulus in response to issues like the coronavirus, right? Or the current economic contraction. So what you do is you say, you keep raising it until we get some inflationary heat, and then we have a decision to make. Yeah. And, you know, that might mean that we get to $500 in a year, right? Or it might mean that we get there in 2 years or 5 years, or we never get there. And then, but then of course you've got to consider these other levers. And one question, and whether we want to be shoveling money into the financial system. And how Stephen has been waiting for a while, and then we're going to come back to Barbara after Stephen.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask David, are you hearing much talk about a UBI in your circles? David?
Sanders?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Now, sorry, what was that question again about the UBI in what circles?
Yeah, are you hearing much talk about it, like during the anti-poverty network or during your work?
Well, I'm not in work, but with the anti-poverty network, I mean, obviously, yeah, there would be a number of people in it who are supportive of the idea, and then there's a few other people that are concerned about, you know, how it might roll out. But no, other than that, I haven't heard it outside of, you know, these types of, you know, gatherings or circles.
So, David, what could we do to enlarge the conversation within the circles that you're mixing? Because it would seem to me that those circles are some of the key people who will be directly impacted, and therefore ought to have a voice.
Oh, and that's what we do. In the anti-poverty network, we obviously, we want to be a voice for those that are on the lowest incomes, and so that's why we do hold meetings and we do a range of things. So, yeah, but hey, you know, we're always looking forward to network with more. Also, we're also part of a national network or coalition called the Living Incomes for Everyone. Have you guys heard of that before? Not heard of it?
Yes, we've heard about this. Josh, you've mentioned some engagement with this. Josh, do you want to unmute your mic, because I remember you had some questions about that exact platform, the program rather.
Oh yeah, I kind of forgot about it. Because there was a question of like, I can't remember. Sorry, you put me on the spot. Give me a second.
I think we were a little unclear about what the structure of that, and whether it was universal or means tested, and whether it was job dependent, like conditional on doing, on taking jobs or certain activities, or what. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so I don't want to get too much into that proposal. What we do tend to do is look at proposals like that, though. So we could have another one. If you stay in the loop, we could do a whole hour and a half on that proposal. But if you want to give us the 30-second or 1 minute version, we'd be happy to hear it.
Me? You're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
not
what
live.
was it?
Oh my goodness, no, I couldn't do it in 30 seconds. Look, what I'd encourage everybody to do is go to the live website. I wasn't ready for this, but do a search and you'll find it. But it's definitely worth having another more in-depth discussion about, for sure.
Sure. We are always pushing for full universality and so forth. But look, we got 5 minutes left. I wanted to sort of circle back. It's been we've kind of gone on a lot of different tangents. I was hoping we didn't start out with Michael's report, which is what I'd hoped to start out with, which was so we may have had a bit of a messy first half, but I think we've covered a lot of interesting ground, and I think we can circle back to MMT because there's a lot about what we're talking about here that basically dovetails with modern monetary theory, and we basically think what I'm suggesting is basically in line with what they're saying as for a particular part of the question. And what they say, which is like, well, not they in general, but an expression, is that conventional economists think the governments have to worry about balancing the budget and about inflation, right? MMT says you only have to worry about inflation. You don't have to worry about balancing the budget. That's the big difference if you want to understand it. Now, what most people do is then say, okay, so we don't have, what most MMT theorists then do is say, since we don't have to balance the budget, let's have all these great government programs run through the job guarantee. What a lot of basic income advocates are, however, saying is, well, look, rather than use that money to create jobs directly, at least some of the time, let's use that extra spending capacity to increase the basic income. When we hit too much inflation, we can either stop increasing or lower the basic income, or we can adjust other inflation settings. And so, look, we've got two more minutes left. Does anyone have a final thought that they want to add before we wrap up?
I'll just quickly mention there was an article in The Conversation today about raising the job seeker rate, and they had all these economists explaining their reason pretty quickly. So it's kind of an interesting article.
Against it or for it?
That they were just talking about raising the rate, and so some of them go $50, some 100 to 150. Most of them go 100 to 150 to raise job seeker, and they explain their reasons.
Now, is that on top of the current amount or on top of the standard amount pre-coronavirus?
Yeah, it's raising it from the 287 a week. And so
I mean, they're still all putting it below the poverty line then.
Most of them, yeah.
Yeah. I think that sounds to me like they're having a more conventional view, which imagines limits that aren't necessarily there. Barbara.
Just one thing is possibly off topic, but not really. The Indue card being put out there, and the cost of doing the Indue card per person is supposedly either 13 or 14,000. The people who get the money on the Indue card currently is one or the other. It's either 13,000 or it costs 14 to run it. How would this cost? I mean, if it's a 14,000 cost, why couldn't it somehow be, like, what is the actual cost of getting the money out there by the government?
Well, look,
because the individual already has a bank account, otherwise they wouldn't get it. And they're paying their own bank fees if there are such thing as bank fees on that. So
that number sounds like it's a little high to me, but there's definitely more admin on a basics card or an Indue card than there is on a cash payment. And then there's more administrative fee on a cash payment that's conditional than there's one on that's not conditional. There's more on one that's targeted than one that's not targeted. So the more we get away from this kind of paternalistic thinking that dominates welfare, where you have to manage welfare recipients and make sure they're, the moral poor, and the deserving poor, not the undeserving poor. The more we get away from that, the more we get to a system which, we imagine the basic income being actually administered not by the welfare office, but either by the tax office or by the Reserve Bank or some other body. And you know what? These people, they can move money around extremely efficiently at great speed. You look at the difference between even just a phone call call the tax office and call Centrelink and see who answers first, right? The Centrelink is deliberately sort of starved and understaffed to make the process of being on welfare more humiliating. And look, with this, that's all got to do with the sort of philosophical and moral framing around that, of which we'll definitely be talking about in future episodes.
I'd love it if we could just press Control Alt Delete and redesign every tax law we've got.
That
And
sounds
every
great.
law we've got.
We can, guys, right? Like they act like we can't, but we can do it. We can rewrite it anytime we want. It's this sense of political impossibility that's sort of self-fulfilling, low expectations. And that's probably, and what'll go on is we'll keep thinking small and fighting the last war and doing and moving slower than events until things get really effing bad. And when they do get really effing bad, then we'll have to do something big and bold. So that what we can do, is take crazy, impossible ideas and normalize them a little bit, so that when things get really bad, that's what people, the ideas lying around, so to speak, are the ones that get adapted. Michael, you've got your hand up.
Just very quickly, what's the attitude to treating the basic income as income for welfare and tax purposes?
Well, look, I hear different. I've heard different positions on this. I don't think it matters that much whether you do or you don't, because you can count it as
part of your income.
As part of your income, and then you can adjust tax rates so that you get the same end result. I think that's a little bit one of the things. I mean, one thing I would say is that moving to a fully universal payment and getting off of having separate welfare payments has one advantage, that if it's done by the tax office, right, then you're only measuring income once. The tax office measures your income, and that's it. Now we've got Department of Human Services and the tax office both measuring and checking your income and cross-referencing, and that's more moving parts and becomes and more things that can go wrong.
I agree with you, Austin. My again, the strategic view from my point of view is, if we did this saying, yes, it will count as income because it's extra income, it will count as income for tax and welfare. We're not changing anything of the rest of the system, so don't panic, guys. But over time, then, of course, it will naturally, as it raises, phase out the welfare benefit, and it will naturally, as it's paid to higher income people, they will pay tax on it at their higher income rate. And so it's
see, to me it's a bit like this question of whether the central bank prints money and then the government spends it, or whether the government spends it and then the central bank prints it, right? It doesn't actually matter the order in what happens. What matters is the overall economic model that everybody involved is
it's more the
using.
mindset of other people, Austin, because you get it. It's more a question of people who are struggling.
Yeah, see, I think we've got to sort of figure out which conversation we're having, and that's why we're going to keep having these monthly talks, and I look forward to a lot more of them with the people who are here. But I think so sometimes it's good to just have a utopian conversation and say, what would be the perfect system? Yeah. Then you think about, okay, what's the difficulties in reaching that? One of those difficulties is navigating the sort of communications landscape. And you kind of got to break all of those things into different conversations. But like, I think what we sort of tend to do a lot is short circuit to the possible. So what that means is you compare with what's already going on and you think, what's the smallest step we could take? So, but like, okay, I'm actually got this other thing that I'm involved in. I'm involved in the World Federalist Movement, right? And there's a whole bunch of people who've been around trying to get everyone to, get together, make the UN stronger, United Nations of Earth kind of thing. And that's been going on forever. And, we have 5 people at the meetings and no one gives a shit. And then there's a new group called Young World Federalists, right? And started by another Australian bloke. And it's got 4,000 or something people following its Reddit, and it's hot. It's got activity. And I spoke to the bloke who runs it. I'm like, what are you doing differently? What are you doing that we're not doing? And he said, what we're doing is we're selling people on the end result. We're talking about what does a unified planet Earth look like? rather than some smaller institutional. Whereas we might be talking about, let's democratize the UN, let's slightly improve the Security Council and do all of these, mega steps. It's actually the person who says, here's the big picture, here's the vision of a world transformed. They're the ones that are actually drawing, some enthusiasm and some participation. So I think it's important for us to figure out, what exactly do we want? What would be the best case scenario as far as we're concerned? And then after we've do that on its own, then after we've had that conversation, we can figure out, well, how do we then negotiate with the people who disagree with us?
Happy with that.
So I get, look, Josh has been getting on me for making sure that these things finish in an hour and a half, and we're already 6 minutes over. But I do want to say
hold
that,
on. Don't use me as an excuse. If everybody agrees we should continue, I have no problem with continuing.
Do people have much more they want to add? Sorry, Barbara, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just agreeing that I'd be happy to continue. Sorry.
Okay, great. Look, I don't want to continue with just me and Michael talking at everybody. The real question is, does anybody who doesn't obsess about these things all the time have a question they want to ask or a point they want to make? So we can address that before we wrap up.
Can we get back in contact somehow?
Yeah, sure. Join Basic Income Australia. Josh, you're going to send a link now in the chat, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've actually just posted it, and I'll reshare it again because it was a little while ago. But so we have a discussion group every month, which is what we're in right now. But we also have an action group. So if you're inspired and you want to take action, do things, this group actually spawned from the action group. We're meeting on the Sunday following the discussion group. So that's Sunday. It's this Saturday at 4 p.m. 4 p.m. Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania time. So if this is at 6, it's 2 hours before that. Yeah, it's difficult now that we're all national and there's different time zones to worry about. But I've just popped a link in. Come join. And if you're on YouTube, then go to basicincomeaustralia.com.
Yeah, so basicincomeaustralia.com. We have the last Monday of the month is this, which is the public facing one that's on YouTube. And then we have the action group where we're just talking to each other, and we're less talking about big picture stuff and more about what we can do. And that happens the first Saturday of every month. Is that right, Josh? You're muted.
Yeah. I'm going to suggest this Saturday, actually, that we make it that they're in the coming, it's the following Saturday, because what happens is sometimes the Saturdays and the Mondays don't line up. But this is a technical thing. We'll talk about it on Saturday. But this month, this session, it's happening this Saturday, 4 p.m.
Yeah, so and if you follow Basic Income Australia on Meetup, you'll always get notifications. You can also follow the Facebook page, and there'll be reminders there. But Meetup's the best because you'll get an email. It'll be harder to miss. That's a good way to stay in touch.
Rennie's got a hand up too, I think.
Rennie, did you?
Rennie, sorry, not Rennie.
Listening, and I've got 100 questions. But basically, you asked where can you hear more input from the poor people, and I've been running for about 18 months a page on Facebook called The Revolting Poor, and there's a lot of grumbling in there because most of them are people that are on Job Seeker that have been on New Start, and sort of the ones that are dismissed as the dole bludgers. And that's a perception that we so desperately need to fix in this country. If David's still with us, I'm sure that he would agree. And I have a number of people from anti-poverty networks that tap into the group, and also from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. On a slightly different tack, my plan is to run for the Senate in the next federal election, not as someone that's been to university, who's been overseas, who's high profile and bankrolled to the hilt, but as one of those poor people who are not at all represented in our parliament.
Will a basic income be in your policy platform? Because that would be the way to get support from members of this group.
I prefer the idea of a thing called a living allowance. I'm at this point still open to discussion, but I'm fundamentally opposed to it being universal.
Oh, well, that's a shame. That's kind of the core of our whole bit. Like, I mean, we that sounds, we could do a whole bit on conditionality. I think the other thing to do one on would be the effects of the UBI on the labour market, which I kind of hoped we'd get to today, but there was too much stuff before we got there. So that's a really important topic to discuss. We hope you'll come back to some of these groups. We want people in these discussion groups who disagree with us. Don't come to the action group unless you agree, because we don't want to debate a basic income there. That's where we want to make it happen. This is the place to come if you want to debate and challenge us. I was really hoping we'd have a conservative deficit hawk join the conversation today so we could argue with them, but the one guy I asked fled the field, so what does that tell you? Michael, you've got your hand up, but I think it might just be left up from before. Did you have something else you wanted to add?
Well, Austin, yeah.
Okay, no worries. Howard, we didn't hear from you at all this time. Do you want to say anything before we shut down?
Look, I have to apologise. For some reason, I thought the meeting started at 7, and then I got held up with something else. So I've just missed everything. So there's nothing. I actually don't know what you were talking about. So can't really comment.
Okay, no worries. Well, you should come to the action group, is what I think Josh is about to say.
No, it's recorded, so you can watch it back. Like if you missed anything.
Where?
Yeah.
Where can
Right.
we watch
On
it
YouTube. We're going to get a link to the YouTube page. If you're on YouTube, you don't need that link because you're already there.
Okay.
But for those of us in the Zoom chat, we're going to send a link through so you can see the rest of the thing. Look, we can also hang around and discuss exchange contacts and stuff like that after I stop the live stream. So I think we're pretty much out of questions on the topic. Yeah. On that note, I think we'll wrap up, and I'm not sure if we're going to have another another discussion group this year, because the last Monday of the month might be too caught up with Christmas and New Year's and stuff like that. So we'll be looking forward to if that changes, there'll be updates on the meetup and the Facebook group. But I think we're looking forward to the last Monday of January, where we'll be picking up the discussion with Fair Go Basic Income Discussions Australia. Thank you very much. I am now ending the live stream.
Okay.
Austin, I'm going to leave too. So